Welcome to our channel. Enjoy the video.
There are disappearances that begin with a scream, a broken window, a blood-stained room, a desperate phone call. And then there are disappearances that begin with something far quieter. A normal day, a familiar routine, a person leaving home without realizing that it may be the last time anyone will ever see them. For her, there was no obvious warning. No dramatic confrontation. No message explaining where she was going. She simply disappeared. At first, nobody believed it was a disappearance at all. Maybe she had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she needed some time alone. There were explanations. There always are. But as the hours passed, those explanations began to collapse. She wasn't answering calls. She wasn't responding to messages. And the people who knew her best couldn't remember a reason she would simply walk away from everything without telling anyone. Then came the first detail that investigators couldn't explain. Her normal routine had been interrupted. Something she was expected to do never happened. And something about the timing was wrong. Detectives began reconstructing her final known movements. Where had she been? Who had spoken to her? Where was she supposed to go next? And most importantly, who was the last person known to have seen her? The answers created a timeline. But it was a timeline with gaps. Large ones. Investigators searched the places she was known to visit. They spoke with friends, relatives, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her. Every conversation produced another fragment. But none of the fragments explained where she had gone. Then investigators found something that should have made the case easier. Her car. It was located abandoned. And that changed everything. Because the vehicle wasn't simply transportation anymore. It was potentially the last physical location connected to her. Detectives began treating it like a crime scene. They looked inside. They checked the seats, the floor, the trunk, the compartments. Every object could potentially answer a question. At first, the car seemed almost disappointingly ordinary. There was no obvious sign of violence. No clear message. Nothing that immediately explained what had happened. But investigators knew something important. People can leave behind clues without realizing they're leaving them. A fingerprint. A misplaced object. A trace of someone who shouldn't have been there. And sometimes, the most important evidence isn't sitting in plain sight. It's hidden. As detectives examined the car more carefully, they noticed details that didn't fit the story they were building. Something appeared to have been moved. Something appeared to have been concealed. And suddenly, the vehicle wasn't just a clue. It was a question. Who had been inside? Why had something been hidden? And what happened during the final hours before she vanished? Because somewhere inside that car, investigators were about to find something that would force them to look at the entire disappearance differently. The car should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it became the beginning of an even darker mystery. Investigators returned to it with a simple objective. Find something. Anything. A clue that could explain where she had gone. They photographed the interior. Examined the seats. Checked the floorboards. Opened compartments. And searched the trunk. Nothing immediately stood out. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No dramatic evidence announcing that a crime had taken place. Just an ordinary vehicle. Left behind under extraordinary circumstances. But experienced investigators know that crime scenes rarely announce their secrets. Sometimes, the smallest detail matters most. So they started again. This time, they looked beyond what was visible. They examined areas that most people would never think to search. Places where an object could be placed deliberately. places where something could disappear without actually leaving the vehicle. And eventually, they noticed something that didn't belong. It wasn't sitting in plain sight. It was concealed. Someone had gone to the trouble of putting it where it wouldn't immediately be discovered. That changed the investigation. Because an object accidentally left behind is one thing. An object deliberately hidden is something else entirely. Detectives documented the discovery and began asking the obvious question. Why was it there? Was it connected to her? Had she hidden it herself? Or had someone else placed it there? Every possibility created another question. And then investigators began comparing the discovery with the timeline of her final known movements. The pieces didn't fit neatly. Something about the car suggested that the story was more complicated than a woman simply leaving and never returning. The vehicle had become a silent witness. It couldn't tell investigators who had been inside. It couldn't explain where she had gone. But it could preserve traces of what had happened. Investigators began looking for those traces. They examined potential fingerprints. They considered physical evidence. They reconstructed the vehicle's movements. And they returned to the people surrounding her life. Because if the hidden evidence had been placed there by someone else, that person may have known something about her disappearance. Then another possibility emerged. Someone may have had access to the car. Someone who knew where she was. Someone who might have had a reason to make certain evidence disappear. The investigation began shifting. What had started as a search for a missing woman was becoming something much more complicated. Detectives weren't simply asking, "Where did she go?" They were now asking, "Who wanted her gone?" But there was still a problem. A clue can point toward a person without proving what that person did. And investigators needed more than suspicion. They needed a connection. So they began reconstructing the timeline again. Every phone call. Every known movement. Every meeting. Every minute that could be accounted for. And slowly, one person's story began to attract attention. Not because investigators had proven anything, but because there were details that didn't quite match. A statement that seemed harmless at first. A timeline that was difficult to explain. And a connection to the car that investigators couldn't ignore. The hidden discovery had done exactly what evidence is supposed to do. It had opened a door. Now detectives had to find out who was standing on the other side. Because if the person they were beginning to suspect was telling the truth, then the hidden evidence meant almost nothing. But if they weren't, it could explain why she disappeared. And the next question would be far more disturbing. What exactly happened during those final hours? By now, investigators were no longer looking at the disappearance as a simple missing person case. The car had changed that. Something had been hidden inside it. And the discovery had created a possibility detectives couldn't dismiss. Someone may have known more than they were admitting. So investigators went back through the timeline. Not once. Again and again. Because when a person disappears, time becomes evidence. Where was she at 6 p.m.? Who saw her at 7? When did her phone stop showing activity? When was the car last seen? And who could account for those missing hours? The answers began narrowing the field. Then investigators focused on a person connected to her final movements. At first, there was nothing dramatic. No confession. No obvious contradiction. Just a series of small details that didn't seem to line up. One statement suggested one thing. The timeline suggested another. And the evidence from the car raised a question that investigators couldn't ignore. If this person had nothing to do with her disappearance, why were their movements so difficult to reconcile? Detectives began examining everything they could legally establish about the timeline. Phone activity. Known locations. Witness accounts. Vehicle movements. Every piece of information was compared against the others. And gradually, the gaps became more noticeable. A few minutes here. An unexplained period there. A detail that seemed insignificant on its own, but became much more important when placed beside the evidence from the car. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. Investigators needed something stronger. They needed evidence that could connect the person to what happened. And that brought them back to the hidden discovery. Because the object found inside the car wasn't important simply because it had been concealed. It was important because of what it potentially connected. The investigation now had two separate questions. What happened to her? And who had access to the vehicle during the critical period? Those questions began pointing in the same direction. But there was another possibility detectives had to consider. What if the hidden item had nothing to do with her disappearance? What if investigators were building a story around a coincidence? That possibility mattered. Because in a missing person investigation, a single clue can be powerful. But it can also be misleading. So investigators kept digging. They looked for independent evidence. Something that could confirm or destroy the emerging theory. Then they found another detail. It didn't solve the case, but it made the timeline even harder to explain. The person investigators were examining appeared to know something about the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Something they shouldn't necessarily have known. And suddenly, the question wasn't only about where she had gone. It was about what someone else knew. The investigation became a race between two possibilities. Either the strange details were coincidences, or they were pieces of a much larger story. And if they were pieces of that story, investigators were getting dangerously close to discovering what happened. But there was still one thing missing. The physical connection. The evidence that could transform suspicion into something investigators could act on. And that evidence would lead them back to the car. Because the secret hidden inside it was about to become much more important than anyone initially realized. The investigation had reached a dangerous point. Detectives had a timeline. They had inconsistencies. They had a suspicious discovery inside the car. But suspicion alone couldn't tell them what had happened to her. They needed something that could connect the pieces. So investigators returned to the vehicle. The car had already been searched. But now they knew what they were looking for. Every detail was reconsidered. Every object was examined in context. Because the question was no longer simply, "What is this?" It was, "Why was this here?" And more importantly, who put it here? The hidden evidence suddenly carried a different meaning. When investigators compared it with the timeline, the circumstances surrounding her final known movements, and the statements they had collected, a troubling picture began to emerge. The possibility that she had simply disappeared voluntarily was becoming harder to reconcile with the evidence. Too many details pointed in different directions. And the people closest to the investigation had begun giving answers that required closer examination. Detectives started reconstructing the final hours piece by piece. One location. Then another. One conversation. Then another. The last confirmed sighting. The last known movement of the vehicle. And finally, the moment when the trail went cold. But there was something investigators still couldn't explain. If someone else had been involved, where was the strongest physical evidence? That question became critical. Because a disappearance can generate dozens of theories. Only evidence can eliminate them. Investigators continued examining the available evidence and comparing it with the statements they had collected. The hidden discovery inside the car became one of the central pieces of the puzzle. Not because it provided an easy answer, but because it challenged the original assumption about what had happened. The car was no longer simply where investigators had found her belongings. It had become a potential timeline. A silent record of what may have happened before she vanished. And yet, even with all the evidence, there was still no perfect explanation. That's what made the case so haunting. There were clues. There were questions. There were contradictions. But there was still a missing person. And until investigators could determine what happened to her, every theory remained incomplete. The case had started with a woman who disappeared. Then it became a search for her car. Then a search for what had been hidden inside it. And finally, a search for the person who might have known why it was hidden. The discovery changed the investigation. But it did not answer the biggest question. Where was she? Because finding evidence inside a car is one thing. Finding the truth about a disappearance is another. And sometimes, the most disturbing cases are the ones where investigators uncover just enough evidence to know that something happened, without ever finding enough to explain exactly what. Her disappearance left behind a trail of unanswered questions. And at the center of it all was the car. A silent object that couldn't speak. Couldn't point a finger. Couldn't tell investigators what happened. But it had preserved one secret. And someone had tried to hide it. The question was whether that secret would ever be enough to reveal the truth. In the end, the car became more than a piece of evidence. It became the last place investigators could look for answers. Inside it, they found clues. Details that didn't fit. Something that had been hidden. And questions that refused to disappear. But a clue is not a confession. And suspicion is not proof. The investigation could reconstruct pieces of the timeline, but one piece remained painfully absent. Horror. She had vanished. And whoever knew the complete story had taken that truth with them. Maybe the hidden evidence was the key. Maybe it was only one piece of a much larger mystery. But one thing was certain. Someone had left something behind. And investigators were never supposed to find it. That is what makes disappearances like this so haunting. Because people can disappear. Evidence can be destroyed. Stories can be changed. But sometimes, something survives. A fingerprint. A photograph. A forgotten object. Or a secret hidden inside a car. And years later, that single detail can become the thing that brings an entire mystery back to life. She vanished without a trace. But the car remembered. And somewhere inside what investigators found was a story someone desperately wanted to keep hidden.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you in the next one.